We are honored to have as our keynote speaker for this evening, Mr. Nickolay Miadenov, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process and Envoy of the UN Secretary General to the Quartet. In introducing Special Envoy Miadenov, it's important for me to emphasize, other than the fact that he was, of course, Defense Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister of Bulgaria and a member of the European Parliament and of the Bulgarian Parliament, the key role that Amos alluded to regarding the UN and Mr. Miadenov specifically in facilitating this fragile ceasefire that we are currently in between Israel and Hamas. Earlier in May, Mr. Miadenov visited Gaza, and just last Wednesday, he briefed the UN Security Council on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank. Mr. Miadenov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for those words. And dear Amos and INSS, thank you very much for organizing this conference on behalf of a few of us on Mekim here. Thank you very much for inviting us also to speak at this event. UN-Israeli relations are somewhat of a sensitive topic, somewhat, being a bit of an understatement. But I have not seen since coming into this position a concerted, serious attempt to actually analyze and have a deep discussion of the relationship between the State of Israel and the United Nations. I hope that today's conference will be that opportunity, as you yourself said, and it will really look at the future, not just at the past. I know that what I've tried to do since taking up the unenviable task of carrying a business card that says Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process at a time when there is no Middle East Peace Process, I've tried to break out of the mold and to prove to both Israelis and Palestinians and Jews and Arabs that the United Nations, particularly the work of the Secretary General and myself here, can be focused on the pursuit of peace. I know that there are many misgivings and suspicions and accusations, and they're certainly not easy to overcome. And to overcome them, we must begin by understanding the complexities of each side. The Israeli public opinion must understand the complexity of what the United Nations is as an organization. And one thing, it is not a monolithic organization, but it is an organization that is the result of a complex network of decisions driven on a large occasion by member states, international law, institutional bodies, etc. But so must the UN understand that Israel is a democratic society with a very vibrant parliamentary political system, which we're experiencing just about now, with a plurality of opinions ranging from one end to the other, and a country that is living in a very dangerous part of the world. And I think if we begin by understanding these complexities, we will actually see that there is great potential in the relationship between the United Nations and the State of Israel. I hope that today's discussion will go beyond the usual platitudes and propaganda and talking points that one hears when we're brought into a discussion about Israel and the United Nations, and we'll look at the potential for the future. I want to outline some areas, I think, broadly speaking, 6 components of the UN-Israel relationship, which I think are quite interesting to discuss. But before that, let me say that if there are three pillars of our understanding, and by our understanding I mean the understanding that the Secretary General, myself, and the United Nations Secretariat has as far as Israel is concerned, that if there are 3 pillars, these are the following 3 pillars. First of all, Israel is not a temporary phenomenon. It is not a colonial project. It is a state that is respected, a member of the United Nations, and it is here to stay. Secondly, it is a legitimate member of the family of nations of the world. And thirdly, it, as much as any other countries around the world, deserves to live in peace and security with all states around it. If we try and approach all discussions from these three pillars, or trying not to stray away from these three pillars, I think we can really delve into the vast potential of what the relationship can be. The first component, if I may, of the relationship between Israel and the United Nations consists of what is everyone's favorite UN political bodies, the UN committees, the General Assembly, the Security Council, certainly the beloved Human Rights Council, the UNESCO Board of Directors, the World Health Assembly of the World Health Organization. I can go on with this list for quite some time, but I think you get the point. These are the bodies in which the politics between member states play out, and where the diplomacy of the member states is really an interaction. For decades, they have been the battleground for intense discussions and debates on the Israeli-Arab conflict, particularly in the last few years focusing on the Palestinian issue, and often been characterized by a lot of bloc voting, most often against your country in particular. Decades of political maneuvering in these bodies have created a multitude, a disproportionate number of resolutions, reports, and committees that we have to deal with on a daily basis. I remember in December 2016, then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon spoke quite openly, as had Kofi Annan before him, of the disproportionate focus on Israel that has, in fact, and I quote him, foiled the ability of the United Nations to fulfill its role effectively, end quote. And certainly my office and some of our team who are in this conference today bear the brunt of a lot of these reports because they have to constantly review them and deal with them. Certainly Israel is not a country that should be or can be above criticism, but it is a country that should not be singled out in any way or form. This is why I want to also talk a little bit about the positive developments, even in these bodies that play out the politics between member states, because over the last few years, particularly since the year 2000, we've seen quite a number of positive developments. If you go back to the year 2000, it is when Israel was admitted as a member of the Western European and other regional group of the United Nations, and that certainly opened up new possibilities for cooperation with member states. 5 years later, the International Holocaust Remembrance Day resolution, which was initiated by Israel, was adopted by the General Assembly. Two other important resolutions later on agricultural technology and entrepreneurship were also adopted by the General Assembly, and going fast forward to 2016, when the ambassador of Israel to the UN was elected for the first time to chair a permanent UN committee in the General Assembly, the 6th Committee on Legal Matters. Now, just looking at these achievements, some may say, well, that's not enough. Certainly you can do more. But if you look at the track record of almost 200 countries that are members of the United Nations, not every country can point to such an active list, and this is due to the diplomacy of your Ministry of Foreign Affairs, your representatives at the United Nations, and there's really a strong focus on doing their work appropriately to represent your country in these fora. The second component consists of the interactions between Israel and various UN agencies on operational matters and that range on a wide number of global issues of concern. And here one can start with the security and peacekeeping missions, emergency medicine, counterterrorism, water technologies, disaster assistance, search and rescue, people with disabilities, cyber technologies. The list is really, really very long. And there's much that Israel can contribute to advancing the UN goals in this respect. I remember a couple of years ago when, or was it last year, when Secretary General Guterres visited Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu hosted a presentation of Israeli startups whose technologies could be used in support of various goals in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly integrated into operations. It was an amazing presentation that was quite useful for everyone. And I really hope that we can see more of this type of cooperation between Israel and specific agencies in the field continue. My favorite areas of that would be really disaster relief, because I think there's a lot of experience in Israel that can be shared, as has been shared already. Telemedicine, which is a completely new area and extremely important for impoverished communities around the world, and clean water and clean energy. And now this whole potential is really, we're only at the beginnings of expanding this whole potential of cooperation between your country and various UN agencies on a wide range of issues. One area really worth noting, however, where the cooperation is really strong and very visible, is education for Holocaust remembrance and the fighting of anti-Semitism. The Secretary General has been very clear that the modern form of anti-Semitism is the denial of the right of the State of Israel to exist. In September last year, UNESCO in New York hosted a high-level event at which many, if not all, big international Jewish organizations were represented to talk about efforts to counter anti-Semitism. And then as a result of that event, one of the achievements was a joint UNESCO World Jewish Congress website created that was focused on facts about the Holocaust and Holocaust education. I think this is a really important area of cooperation that has expanded over the last few years, and certainly there's much more that needs to be done in this respect. The third component is the relationship between Israel and the various peacekeeping forces that the United Nations has deployed here in the region. And certainly this relationship hasn't always been easy and quite often has been tense and exposed to criticism, but I do seriously believe that missions like UNDOF and UNIFIL play a role in preventing undesired escalation at Israel's northern frontiers. Most recently, UNIFIL has been engaged quite actively in confirming and reporting to the Security Council on the tunnels that have been discovered from Lebanon into Israel, and report not just on confirming their existence, but openly reporting to the Security Council these tunnels as a violation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Meanwhile, our colleagues in UNDOF, who had for a very long time not been able to deploy on the Bravo side of the area of separation in the northeast, have been able to return to some of their positions and practically on a daily basis report on how they work actively to deconflict situations of tensions. In fact, just a couple of weeks from now, I think, I've initiated the second meeting of all the regional UN missions in this part of the Middle East in Jerusalem, at which we will bring together UNIFIL and UNDOF, and including our colleagues from Lebanon, Syria, also inviting our friends from the MFO in the Sinai to really look at the regional challenges and the complexities of the map that we have to deal with, and share experience in how to work in the field of preventive diplomacy and de-escalating tensions. So, despite the difficulties, this area, this component of the relationship between Israel and peacekeeping forces remains very, very important. The fourth component is the work that the UN's humanitarian and development agencies do here on the ground. Most of their work, if not all of their work, is focused in the West Bank and Gaza. Nearly all of the UN agencies are represented, I believe, except UNHCR. You have UNRWA for that. There are about 20 agencies that have offices and work here, and their essential mandate is to work on everything from creating jobs to building infrastructure infrastructure to improving the capacity of Palestinian services and institutions, and funding and supporting hospitals, whether they're in Gaza or in the West Bank, and making sure that the sewage doesn't pour freely out into the sea. That's actually a very serious concern for us over the past year. There are daily interventions between these agencies on the ground and various representatives of the Israeli state. Perhaps the smallest number of them are with the foreign ministry and with the diplomats. The largest number of them are with agencies like COGAT and CLA and various other representatives who are important. Most of these people are not even anywhere close to diplomacy or politics. They're doctors and engineers and technical experts in various fields. They need to engage with the Israeli state on a daily level. And I think quite often what I've experienced from these interactions, that you see how the perspective of one side and the perspective of other side influences each other in terms of these interactions in a very constructive manner. Of course, this is the area where there are also a lot of tensions. And it would not be fair to say that such tensions don't exist elsewhere in the world where our colleagues are working. All of our agencies that are functioning in the West Bank and Gaza are guided by the mandates that they have from the various governing bodies. Mandates that include very clearly support for the Palestinian people, for ending the occupation and establishing a Palestinian state through peaceful negotiations. If I have to summarize, this is the summary of what those multitude of mandates boil down to: supporting and helping Palestinians and Israelis achieve through peaceful negotiations the establishment of two states living side by side in peace and security. And although this area, particularly under the current political environment, causes often friction and discussions in the media and among politicians, I believe that if you take away that perspective for two states, for a political negotiated solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of what are the parameters that have been agreed by the UN Security Council, if you take away that perspective, the framework under which these agencies work on the ground will ultimately collapse. And although some people may feel that this may be a benefit to the state of Israel, I would strongly argue that it will ultimately negatively affect the security and well-being of both Jews and Arabs on the ground, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Because the work that our agencies do, whether it is in Ramallah, in Gaza, or across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, is critical to keeping the stability of the environment here. Fifthly, there's an important component which is perhaps of rising importance, and that is the political role of the Secretary General and his representative here on the ground, and currently that happens to be me. UNSCO, the mission that I lead, was established in 1994 to assist in the implementation of bilateral agreements and ultimately reach a comprehensive peace agreement. That's why I'm the last person stuck with the Middle East peace process on my business card, and often get questions whether which exactly peace process do you deal with? Is it Yemen, Syria, Libya, or elsewhere, or are you responsible for the entire region? None of these two are true. But I believe that a lot of our work, particularly over the last few months and year, has really focused on preventive diplomacy. And this is an area where the Secretary General is very keen that the United Nations focuses its efforts, not only to deal with the aftermath of conflict, but to try and work with all parties to prevent conflict. We've been able to engage actively and constructively in a very strong partnership with Egypt to keep the situation in Gaza from exploding, to provide humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza, provide them with electricity and create temporary, hopefully permanent jobs for them in the belief that this is the only way through which we can avoid this constant cycle of violence that brings Israel and Hamas back into conflict, and that the longer-term issues that are important for all sides, sustained ceasefire, return of the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza, normalization of the environment inside the Gaza Strip, addressing the humanitarian question of the Israeli soldiers and civilians who are missing in Gaza. A number of other longer-term challenges can only be addressed if we have a prolonged period in which we avoid a full-blown war. This is an extremely important part of our work currently. We also engage very actively with civil society actors, report regularly to the Security Council on our work, and although the Security Council is quite clearly divided on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian file, I think our monthly reports to the Council are extremely important to keep those member states informed of what we see as to the reality of the ground. These reports are fact-based. They try to avoid issues that flare up in political discussions, but certainly it is important that we continue that work. And very lastly, there's a whole new area of cooperation between the UN and Israel that actually doesn't involve anyone from your foreign ministry or anyone from the United Nations. And it's a very fascinating new area. And this is the explosion, the exponential growth of Israel, of interest in Israel in Model UN programming. Young people across the country, and I'm sure there's some of you here as well, anyone here from Model UN? Thank you. Wow, quite a lot. Please next time sit in the front, not at the back. Is really a fascinating development, because I think it helps slowly over time change the attitudes and create a different understanding of how the United Nations work and how the relationship between your country and the United Nations works and can transform itself. So these are 6 areas that we've looked at as areas where there's interest, there's potential. Obviously, there's a lot of complicated history between Israel and the UN, but certainly where is potential for growth, and I think very, very important today. And in closing, I want to go back to a quote with which Amos started from Foreign Minister Sharet when Israel joined the United Nations, that Israel's acceptance into the UN could advance peace and the establishment of an equal and friendly relations with the Arab states. I think this is still a lofty goal that is important for all of us, because no temporary solution to the current situation that we face today will be sustainable unless there is a broad political resolution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. And that is something that has been in the making since the very, very creations of the State of Israel, and certainly something that still remains to be achieved. Many people will say outside of this room that this is the mother of all conflicts in the Middle East, etc. You've heard all of these statements in the past. Certainly, many of them have been proven wrong, given the vast destruction that has been spread around the Middle East by Islamic radicalism and other factors. But without resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, without moving away from the tension that this creates, certainly that will not allow for the rest of the region to live in peace and prosperity, a goal that we all aspire to. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today, and good luck for the rest of the